Academy of Psychology very recently. In fact, this happens to be one of the newest committees which has been set up by NAO. And within a very short time, we have been able to organize this dialogue on Psychologists for Human Rights. I need to thank Professor Vinithy Panda, our president, for that. She's taken the initiative to set it up. And it has as members some very distinguished psychologists from the country. Professor Vinithy Panda herself, excuse me, who's the president, she's a member. This generally does not happen, but she was gracious enough to offer herself, as all of us know. She's someone who has been working all her life for the rights of the tribals. It's because of the work which Professor Panda has done and Professor Jeet Mohanty has done that the tribal languages have come to be recognized, and particularly in Orissa, I think they have become very, very important and have become part of the educational policy. We have on the committee Professor Vindhya, who till very recently was the Deputy Director of Tata Institute of Social Sciences campus at Hyderabad, and you would know that she is internationally recognized for her work on gender violence. We also have Professor Rumana Siddiqui, and she's been working on minority rights for a long time and has very, very important publications in that particular area. Ajay Gulzar happens to be a very young psychologist who is our link with the social policy makers in India. He's with the Lok Sabha Secretariat, and we're very happy that we have someone, a psychologist, who has this link with the policy makers in India. Don't need to say much about why psychologists should be interested in human rights. I think we all know that we do psychology because we want a certain kind of a society which is inclusive, a society in which all of us are free, all of us humans are free, not only humans, but also others. I would also include animals. A society in which we care for others, we care for human dignity. The only problem is that psychologists, they want all of this, but the question which we need to ask is, do they actually practice it themselves? Do they actually advocate for a society which is inclusive? Do they inform us on conditions under which human rights violations take place? All of these issues are very important. And to start a dialogue on this, we are very, very lucky to have somebody who's been a world leader on human rights education for psychologists. In Professor Polly Hagenas. Polly has been a world leader. She was the convener of the Human Rights Committee for the Psychology Associations of Europe called EPFA, and has many, many books to her credit. We're also lucky to have Professor Vindhya. These two will be leading or will be starting the dialogue first in this series, as I said, on Psychologists for Human Rights. I'm saying first in the dialogue series because we are going to have many more during the year. And hopefully, Polly and Professor Vindhya, both of them will come back and join us for the dialogues which we have the next time, or whenever that is possible for them. So welcome again. I suggest that what we do is that we will spend the first hour or so in listening to what Professor Polly and Professor Vindhya have to say. They will make presentations, they will use PPTs. And since this is a dialogue, the next hour we will spend in dialoguing on what they have said, what you would like to share on Psychologists for Human Rights. You will notice that we have not called this webinar. And there is a reason behind that. The reason is that we do not want you to be only passive listeners. We like to listen to you. We would like you to participate. We are equal participants in the dialogues which are going to happen here. So thank you for joining us. Whether you are on Zoom or you are on YouTube, please do join with your comments after the presentations are made. The first presentation will be made by Polly, and she'll be followed up by Professor Vindhya. So Polly, you're next now, and we'd like to listen to you.
Thank you so much. I feel delighted, I feel honored, and I hope also a lot to learn today, because I think this is the first dialogue on human rights and psychologists in the world, I suppose. So it's really a great opportunity. Can I share my screen? I shall try to do so. Where am I?
Down below.
Yeah, but I don't have the mine. Yes,
Share screen.
Yeah, that I have, but it's not. Where is my?
If you move the cursor, then maybe you can get it.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
I have here some. Sorry. You see it? Yeah. You see my screen? I see it.
No.
We don't see Polly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm afraid the
Yes, we
connection.
can hear.
We can hear you.
connection. Fine. So I share again because the connection
Yes,
was this.
yes, now it's visible.
Yes.
Now it's good. Fine. So we are reflecting today on the role psychologists can play as epistemologists, educators of human rights, researchers who generate knowledge on conditions and factors associated with the violation of human rights and with the promotion of human rights, and discussing how we can act as advocates of social policies that can help build more humane societies and the kind of societies we are envisioning, also of the ideal image of a human being. Human rights know a very long history all over the world. In different religions and philosophical traditions, and there's even a long legal history, as demonstrated in the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, the protections of the rights of workers in 1919 under auspices of the International Labour Organization, and attempts to protect the rights of citizens, like minorities in general, were so far unsuccessful. Because for a very long time, the political opinion was that the treatment of citizens was reserved to the own state and not to other governments of international institutions. But due to the atrocities of World War II, the international community became aware of the necessity of working together and to prefer words and discussions above weapons and wars. So the United Nations was created in 1954. Today, human rights discourse is based in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And the equal and inherent dignity of every human being is the basis of the human rights philosophy and practice. Among the authors of the Declaration was not only Eleanor Roosevelt, but also Halsa Makta, I hope I pronounce well, from India, and she changed the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal. And if you go to YouTube, you can see a small video about all the women who were involved in drafting the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration developed, and it was a very unique process of intercultural and interreligious cooperation by an international group of people from Lebanon, the USA, Australia, China, India, Chile, Soviet Union, France, and UK. And at the moment, the UDHR is still the most widely supported document on human rights. And it is an inspiration for all of humanity and continues to serve as the foundation of a shared value system of humanity, or for human well-being, we can say. It's focused on the voice of all humans, especially those who need it most, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the poor, in other words, what I call the not so obvious people. And the UN and the UDHR have united humanity over the past 75 years. However, although we hardly meet people disagreeing with human rights, the implementation of human rights leaves a lot to be desired. And I think that's why we are here. Following the adoption of the UDHR, two international covenants were adopted in 1966. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right implying that the state abstains from interfering in the liberty of every human, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it's about a debt obligation of the state to stand up for its citizens and take appropriate measures. The UDHR, the ICCPR, and the ICACR together form the International Bill of Human Rights. When I looked at the site, India has ratified 8 conventions and optional protocols. You can find it on the site of the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, among which, and I have chosen 4, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the International Convention of the Elimination of All Forms on Discrimination, the Conventions of the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So I have made some discussion points, but I think there will be many more. To what extent are the ratified conventions followed up by action and programs, and what needs to be done most urgently? As already has been said by Professor Tripathi, the core principle on which all the other principles of the human rights are grounded is the inalienable equal dignity of every person. And that's the foundation of freedom and justice in the world. Dignity is opposed to an internal quality, an inherent psychological characteristic, but it has also to be expressed in social relationships and comes in the form of respect for the person and appreciation of others. And dignity has to be provided in a healthy context and with respect for the environment. And a person can only realize a dignified life if the society enables this person to do so. What are the implications for psychologists of the UDHR? I think that psychologists, by their research-based knowledge and by the mission of our profession, we have a moral obligation to apply this knowledge for the well-being of humanity and its environment. And this needs to be expressed in all aspects of psychology, in research, education, in ethics, professional practice, in community psychology, and also in and maybe also politics. Human rights from a moral framework of psychologism, they have an obligation to prove that human rights 2020. Faced with the mounting problems that our shrinking world confronts, it behoves us to find common ground, relying on the precepts of the UDHR as a lodestone to guide our thinking of and consequent engagement with the human condition. Psychology must succeed without. We psychologists tend to help people to adjust to the world, that forget to ask how can help the world to be better. So for discussion point to my knowledge, no psychologists was drafting this part. And for further development of human rights, psychologists are indispensable.
All your screen has disappeared now.
Can you see again? Connection is not that well.
Not yet, not
It's
yet.
not good. Yes, I see. Can you hear me again? I can
No.
try if there is a better place. Can you?
No, we can't say anything. There's nothing on the screen yet.
No. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but we can't see the screen yet.
I try again. I'm
Try
sorry.
sharing the screen. Okay, good, good.
Hopefully it's going better. Okay. Next to dignity, two other principles are of basic importance for psychologists. Those are freedom and inclusion or non-discrimination. The Nobel laureate philosopher and economist Amartya Sen has written extensively and originally on human rights. He sees human rights not as legal proceedings, but as societal ethics, as societal pronouncements as to what should be done to fulfill the rights of a person. As human rights are recognized freedoms seen as entitlement of a person to development and realization of his or her capabilities. He puts the emphasis on the duty to take care of the rights of a person. How can our profession help to give people freedoms to development? Inclusion, I think, and attachment are as important and opposite to othering and disconnecting or alienation. Yesterday, it was World Suicide Day, and the suicide rate among youngsters during the COVID pandemic has risen. And a lot the alienation, especially here in the West, of youngsters to society. And human rights offer security and protection. And I think that's a safe basis to become a human in a humane world. The basis for freedom to explore the world and to the groups they want to belong, and to the state and the institutions. Professor Tripathi and Gayatri Spivak describe the process of othering as the marginalized us and the use of differences in beliefs and customs to define them as the outgroup, marginalizing and excluding members. And researchers in the area of cognition have shown a tendency to look for essences in objects and also in persons and groups. And such a tendency leads to understand social categories, natural kinds. They are viewed as having fixed, underlying identity determining. Starts with person or group, othering grief. Yes, and the process of othering is subtle and often non-intentional, stemming from normative thinking, from the power of self-evidence. And nevertheless, othering are hardest. For example, thinking always outside the norm, even when they doing their best to become part of the norm, they always fall between two stools. Can you hear me again? Can you hear me?
Holly, it is breaking constantly. The only saving grace is that we can read the slides. So we are connecting. I mean, we're just understanding in some way, but yeah, the voice is breaking.
Shall I make a break and continue after Professor Vinja and try to get a better place?
We can hear you now. Just continue. Suppose it breaks, then we'll tell you. It's better now.
It's better now, okay. Where are we? So we were here at othering, yes? It is one of the constructive tasks of psychologists to help people and societies to unlearn othering and exclusion, because exclusion brings forward STEM perspectives and behaviors and causes exclusion at the same time again. Prejudices, stereotyping, generalizations, and factual matters can add to exclusion. I'm looking to ways to extrapolate the attachment theory to be used in human rights and psychology. Maybe Bowlby will turn around in his grave, I don't know. But we psychologists know more than anyone else that human beings cannot live without belonging and attachment. Therefore, psychological intervention needs always to be directed at the person as well as the context the person is living in. Discussion point 4, how can the profession contribute in helping groups to overcome their perceived unbridgeable differences? The concept of power is a very important concept in human rights and psychology, because human rights are about human relationships, and specifically about unequal relationships and inequity. An equal relationship, no power ecological or biological, physical, political, and equal distribution of land. For example, in colonialism, people were deprived of their lands and often deprived of their cultures. And even worse, in slavery, people were deprived of possession of their bodies, of their languages, and of their freedom. Those power differences have huge psychological implications for human relationships, for groups, and for individuals as well. Psychologists know what exclusion and discrimination can do. When we were preparing, we were talking about the universality of human rights, and I think that's a point for discussion. They have always been debated and will be. Critical views come from different perspectives. From political, authoritarian regimes don't like to give power away or to change the way they think the social order has to be. An example is the fair political demand the right to give their own interpretation of human rights. Such interpretations invariably entail an explanation with less freedom and more enforced on uniformity. And some of the critique is based on the assumption that human rights are a Western invention. Colonial wars continued after World War II. See India, Great Britain, Algeria, Indonesia, wars in the Middle East and in African countries. Colonized nations in the majority world, however, tried to liberate themselves in the decolonization movements and liberation wars around the same time as the UDHR developed. And this perspective was recognized in 2007 when the United Nations Declaration right. You can't hear me?
We can hear you, Padma.
You can hear, okay. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted by UN General Assembly. And by the end of the 20th century, hardly any colonized nation existed, but the rights of indigenous people and the compensation for colonization are still on the agenda. And also for religious reasons, this resulted in different interpretations of the UDHR, for example, in the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, but also civil and political rights versus economic and cultural rights. The tendency between respect for alternative formulations of human rights and universality of the principles of the UDHR has been summarized by Anne Naim. The essential quality of the universality of human rights may be explained in terms what he calls the three C's: the concept, the content, and the context of human rights. So human rights principles are universal, but embedded in local practices, priorities, and actions. So the concept is universal, but the context and the content is always local. Therefore, a local approach in a global world is needed. Since all human rights have their own normative systems, which are necessarily shaped by their particular context and experiences, any universal concept is by definition a construct of a hypothesis. So we have always to talk and to discuss on a global basis about human rights, and neither assume nor impose our own ideas and go from one relativist perspective to another. Professor brings psychological approach to the rights of the collectives and of indigenous people. These are violated and restricted not only in India, but all over the world. Like we saw in Canada, is the Kamloops Indian Mental School, where 200 people, so not a right approach will help alone, but intervention programs aimed at empowering the persons as well as groups. And the most perfect ideal have not fulfilled yet the inherent promises to humanity, the obligations, and what in fact has been realized in practice. My favorite authors are Hannah Arendt and Amartya Sen. Arendt argues that the so-called rights to have rights remains the key to the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Without inclusion by the community, the assertion of your rights by itself makes no sense. This can be seen most clearly by examining the treatment of this and other states. Since refugees have no state to secure their civil rights, the only rights they have to fall back on are human rights. Amartya Sen has argued that need to be given the underprivileged, the marginal, stripped of their identities. But basically, Mary Nyangwezo writes, differences in our moral systems ought to be respected, but differences that undermine basic human rights ought to be challenged. So I think psychology needs a shift in professional ethics to societal responsibility for human rights in order to move towards an inclusive, human rights-based and oriented psychology. The present codes are about transgressions by psychologists, and clients can complain to associations. I think we need a possibility to complain about misconduct or indifference of psychologists by any citizen, including colleagues. Most important, we need a shift from codes focused on enforceable rules to codes focusing on aspirational goals, to do well and take care in line with Amartya Sen, with commitment and action. Intentionally, I mention indifference. Our knowledge, skills, and experience as professional psychologists give us responsibility and the obligation for commitment, not only for our present clients, but also for humanity. This is not very easy, I realize, and it needs support from the whole community of psychologists. How can we develop a more inclusive ethics, creation of the dignity of a human being? So how we need to incorporate human rights into psychology? Done two ways I want to mention. One way is education. In 2016, human rights experts and psychologists came together at a global campus of human rights in Venice for meeting of education and fundamental rights awareness. This meeting resulted in a report with a base and will be followed winners in the years to come. And with the topic of human rights education, we can fill a whole webinar or even more. For now, it is education about human rights, providing knowledge, education through human rights, which include learning and teaching in a way that respects the rights of both educators and learners, and education for human rights, which includes empowering persons to enjoy and exercise their rights and respect and uphold the rights of others. Human rights need also to be reflected in the schools and institutions, in our universities. For example, some universities have policies related to human rights, and in Sweden is already a human rights-based hospital. In December 2020, the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights was started, planning to organize webinars on human rights education. It has a monthly bulletin, each articles, events, and stories, and they are welcomed. These are two ways to incorporate human rights into psychologists, to start discussions on a global base, because we realize in Europe that we are one global community of psychologists, and all this diversity needs to be incorporated into psychology as well as into human rights. To end, a human rights-based and oriented psychologist is, to my opinion, needs a critical reflection on the science of psychology and its intersection with human rights principles and values, particularly as it relates to the hidden exclusion and undervaluation of persons and groups as a result of the historical development of psychology and its philosophical basis. Historically, psychology has not been an inclusive science and practice. Often, the history telling how psychology developed has a Western basis bias. There have also been outside Europe and America instances of mirrors and psychology. Psychologists show diversity in emotional approaches, bearing in mind that all indigenous. For one, psychology will be enriched by integrating
Holly, your screen has vanished, so also the voice. If you can hear me, just check once.
Can you hear me again? Yeah.
I can now hear you. Yeah, yes, I can see you also now.
Fine, and I will see if I. Yeah. Here we are. Did you hear the last sentence that we need to incorporate all psychologists and that psychology will be enriching theories and research from more? We have always been indigenous. So a human rights-based and oriented psychology is an inclusive psychology, has a decolonial perspective, is informed about historical power relations, accountability, and is building bridges above all, a human rights-based and oriented organization. It has the equal principle. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. Thank you. Let me just check with all of you here. Understand that there has been a problem with communication, but I think because of the PowerPoint, I think you have perhaps understood what Polly wanted to communicate. Shall we request Professor Vindhya to make her presentation first and then engage with what Polly has raised as discussion points, or you like to do it now? I think both seem to be, both presentations are connected in some way because Professor Vindhya is going to talk about gender violence and the issues which I think relate with dignity and with other kinds of things. It looks like that Professor Vindhya is already ready for her presentation, so maybe I think she should go first. Then we can follow it up with the dialogues.
Yeah, no, I was just getting a little anxious about the presentation, so I put it up.
Yeah.
So should I start? Am I audible?
What do you think? What do you think? What would be a better? I think Dr. Verma wants to say something. Dr. Verma, come in. You want to say something?
Sir, not right now. No, I want to just, I like to hear Dr. Vindhya.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
All right. I think let's take. Let's listen to Professor Vindhya first, and then I suggest that based on Professor Polly Hagenau's presentation, there are going to be questions which you're going to ask about human rights and psychologists. Be prepared with your interventions, with your whatever ideas you may have. Okay, so Professor Vindhya?
Yeah. Can you see my presentation? Is my presentation visible? Yeah.
Vindhya, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, I feel very bad about this technical glitch. Anyway, these are inevitable. But let me start by saying thanks to Professor Tripathi and Professor Minati Panda for initiating this conversation on human rights. And despite the technical glitches and connectivity problems that we had in Professor Polly's presentation, I think we kind of got the gist of it. And thank you for laying down that historical and conceptual framework of human rights and its implications for epistemology, methodology, and practice issues in psychology. As I said, we're feeling really bad about the connectivity issues, but I suppose, sometimes this can't be helped. But we got the gist of, what she was saying. And I'm not really very sure whether I have the competence to engage with articulating a framework relevant to psychology in India. But perhaps my only claim to being invited today to speak is the fact that for several years, I was involved with the human rights movement in the then undivided state of Andhra Pradesh. And I kind of did my little bit. I contributed in broadening the expansion of the concept of human rights from its association with political rights and violations by the state to violations by social institutions, particularly that of patriarchy and caste and the intersections between the two. And perhaps my second claim to be here is that I was also involved in developing a gender-sensitive, rights-based module for responding to gender-based violence that is being used in crisis intervention services across the country. And as the first project director of what is known as Sakhi one-stop centers, it's a central government scheme that was introduced in the wake of the horrific Nirbhaya case. These one-stop centers provide integrated services, psychosocial, medical, legal, shelter services to women and girls who have been affected by gender-based violence. So as the first project director of this particular initiative in the state of Telangana, where I am currently based, I was responsible for actually designing and implementing a model of psychosocial intervention that is based on the principles of human rights. So, these are my only two claims for, being here today. But it is perhaps, I also would like to say that it is perhaps ironical that both these efforts of mine were outside the ambit of mainstream psychology. And I would like to say that the term human rights itself has not been in widespread use by those of us who are students, researchers, and practitioners in India. And hence, this particular initiative, I feel, is timely and welcome, for we can no longer afford to ignore the relevance and value of human rights for psychology. Now, to begin, again, just wanted to check. I hope the presentation is visible. Yeah, okay. To begin with, I would like to say that, as I said, I'm not really going to engage with articulating a framework as Professor Polly has given, but all I would like to do is to invite your attention to what I think are some critical gaps in conceptualizing human rights in psychology in India. And taking off from what Polly has indicated, human rights discourse is present or ought to be present at three different levels. One as guiding principles for research and practice. Second, as a compass for advocacy and social action. And third, to provide some kind of a perspective, epistemological perspective for knowledge production. Now, coming to the first level, I think we can say that we in psychology in India have been kind of in the past couple of years, we have gone ahead and acknowledged and implemented in our research a code of ethics for conduct of researchers. I say this in the last couple of years because I remember as a student, both at the master's level and doctoral level, we had never heard, I mean, of course, I'm speaking about way back in the 1980s and late 70s and 80s, but we had not heard of a code of ethics, for researchers. But now, of course, we have courses, we have modules, we have institutional review boards that lay down, a mandatory code of ethics for researchers. So I think we have made some amount of progress in acknowledging and implementing in our research a code of ethics for conduct of researchers. Mostly, I would say that it has kind of boiled down to acknowledging the importance of vigilance about breaches of confidentiality and taking informed consent of our participants, both of which ensure protection of rights of our research participants. At the second level, which is human rights serving as a guide or compass for advocacy and social action, I think we have progressed somewhat in the mental health sector, wherein after years of struggle and activism, by several groups across the country, an outcome was seen in the mental health policy that came out in, I think, 2014, and the Mental Health Care Act introduced in 2017, both of which were framed in the context of the United Nations CRPD, Convention on Rights of People with Disability, that Polly was referring to, as well as WHO standards of mental health. So as a result of this, not only is mental health care, of course, there are a lot of limitations, but mental health care is seen as a basic right for all. And more importantly, places the onus on the state to develop a roadmap and provide funding for ensuring appropriateness and accessibility of care. More importantly, I feel mental health care is no longer exclusively, within the ambit of healthcare, but has come to be regarded as part of the part of the broader development discourse and linked to social determinants and structural barriers particularly of caste, class, and gender-related disparities, as well as to corresponding values of dignity, equity, universality, and so on, which Polly was referring to. And there are, of course, several innovations, particularly in community mental health programs in India, of which we can be justifiably proud, which have, developed robust responses to mental health care. Now, these initiatives, again, for reasons of time, I'm not able to, elaborate on all of them, but these initiatives have sought to drive home the point that mental health is primarily a social justice issue. As Dr. Bhargavi Dawar, the founder of Bapu Trust in Pune, a community mental health organization, as she says. And that if we do not bother about having adequate pathways, to care in place, it can well lead to churning of huge social crises, such as higher mortality rates, increasing suicides, homelessness, unemployment, as well as, of course, segregation and various other human rights violations. So what I'm trying to say here is that adoption of a human rights lens in the mental health advocacy sector has meant that mental health and well-being have now found their way to sustainable development goals and interventions that seek to place the needs of the person first. And vocabularies such as balancing care with rights and the pursuit of capabilities, derived again from Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, which, Polly was referring to. So these kind of vocabularies, such as balancing care with rights and pursuit of capabilities with focus on participation and agency, these are now entering mainstream mental health conversations. And I think that is a very gratifying development. Again, as I said, for reasons of time, I cannot wish to elaborate here further, but sufficient to say that the interlinking of social determinants of mental health, development, and human rights has certainly helped in envisioning new models of mental health care. Now, coming to the third level, which is, epistemological perspective, and how this perspective informs our knowledge production, I think we are on the weakest, ground here, in my view. Now, a key criticism, and I'll just take up only two key challenges in my view. What are the key challenges to having or to adopting a human rights framework for psychology in India? The first challenge is, as Polly has already referred to it, which is, that human rights, the very concept, the very construct is derived from a Western discourse. It is a product, of course, of the post-World War II context in the West, and hence not applicable to us in India. Also, the construct of the individual is rooted in the principle of autonomy, which is, again, as we know, derived from the liberal political philosophy of Western democracies. And it is said that such a construct of the autonomous individual conflicts with the collectivist nature of our society, where primacy is given to the group. The whole orientation is towards the group over rights of the individual. And given this collectivist nature of our society, the rights of the person vis-a-vis the interests of the wider community is regarded as a case of competing of rights. And in India, it is played out, at least, I feel it is played out really very starkly as rights of citizenship versus that of tradition or culture. And but what I would like to what I would like to say here is, one second, that this kind of cultural rights argument can be problematic. Why? Because they tend to reproduce the hierarchies of, particularly of patriarchal or casteist domination. And nowhere is this seen so starkly as in the case of conflict between women's rights as equal citizens and the community's right to cultural practices. And here I would like to give examples of certain, what I would call as the watershed or defining moments, in this particular conflict. And these are the examples of what are known as the Shabano case, the Roop Kanwar case, particularly in the 1980s. As we all are aware, Polly may not be aware, but I'm sure all of us are aware that in the Shabano case, it was a Muslim woman's right to maintenance that was seen in conflict with the community and the community's expression. And in the Roop Kanwar case, the burning of a wife on the funeral pyre of her husband, of her dead husband, was seen as the expression of an old cultural practice. So assertion of cultural rights and primacy of cultural rights has also been problematic, as seen in the case of Bhamari Devi. Again, the woman whose tragic gang rape by so-called upper caste men was a response to their perception that she was going against the accepted cultural practice of child marriage when she was campaigning against the practice in the villages of Rajasthan. So as a kind of quote unquote punishment to her campaign against a time-honored practice like child marriage, she was subjected to gang rape by 5 upper caste men. Now, in both these cases, in fact, in all the cases, it led to legislations, new laws that actually underscored the importance of affirming constitutional rights of equality and liberty, over cultural rights. I'm just giving these examples not only because, as I said earlier, these cases represent a watershed in our recognition that we need to give precedence to what are known as absolute rights. For example, freedom from degrading and abusive treatment, as in the case of, in the case of Roop Kanwar, of course, she was killed. In the case of Bhamari Devi, she was gang raped. So we need to give precedence to absolute rights, that is freedom from these kind of abuses, vis-a-vis limited rights of the community. Thus, a key challenge, Thus, a key challenge, and here I come to the second one, key challenge, is that, in India, we see a contradiction between a democratic political system, which is again reflected in the constitution that we have. So there is a contradiction or a gap between a democratic political system and hierarchical social order, which is actually a challenge to equality in India. So while our democratic political system holds the promise and guarantees of rights, our social order is characterized by inequalities of caste, religion, gender, ethnicity, and so on. Therefore, what I think, since this is just a kind of an initial conversation on human rights, I would like to put forth this view that any call for psychologists in India to adopt a human rights-based approach requires understanding and importance of this context of power, power that is both structural and material as well as discursive. And at the material level, power is, of course, manifested in many, many ways, but very starkly in denial or restriction of access to resources. It could be to women, it could be to so-called lower castes, it could be to tribals, to other sexual minorities, and so on. So at the material level, it is denial of or restrictions on access of resources, like education, it could be employment, property, or a range of resources. But at the discursive level or attitudinal level, power imbalances can be manifested in terms of prejudice, stigma, humiliation, and so on. So if we need to adopt a critical human rights-based approach, and here I completely concur with what Polly had said about recognizing the importance of power. So I think we need to make a fundamental commitment to acknowledge, name, and address wherever possible the operation and reproduction of power. And if we are to understand, name, and even expose the dynamics of power, then we need to theorize the relationship between the social context, social injustice, and human rights violations in a much more explicit manner than we have been doing. Of course, I'm aware there is tremendous amount of research, work done in India. Professor Tripathi earlier on, referred to the work of Professor Minati Panda and Professor Ajit Mohanty on language rights of tribals. I'm aware of that there is huge work on poverty, deprivation, and disadvantage, done again by Professor Girishwar Mishra, Professor Janak Pandey, and colleagues. Professor Tripathi himself has done enormous work on intergroup relations, on collective victimization. So there is this whole range of work, and I'm not trying to absolutely minimize or undermine this kind of work. All I'm saying is that as students of psychology, we need to kind of frontally engage with the dynamics and manifestations of power in a much more explicit manner than we have been doing. So the structural, political, and economic conditions which give rise to inequalities, which maintain inequalities and human rights violations, are by and large ignored as peripheral by us in psychology, because I think mostly we think that all this is beyond the scope of psychology. We feel engaging with the structural conditions is the task of sociologists, economists, political scientists, whereas we are only going to look at only the microscopic individual. But all I can say here is that the trend now is on interdisciplinarity and building cross-disciplinary linkages, and the fertilization of ideas that comes from cross-disciplinary linkages. I think we should take advantage of that, and that's the way we will be able to come up with more humane knowledge production. And second, when we neglect power, we invariably individualize human suffering by locating psychological problems within the individual, and we thereby ignore their root causes in structures of discrimination, inequality, and oppression. So the power then becomes objectified as the psychological, psychological impact becomes the main focus, stripped of the context and causes. So what I would like to conclude by saying is that we kind of need to focus on these manifestations of power if we are to adopt a critical human rights approach. And also, I would like to conclude by saying study of power imbalances does not mean focus only on the powerless. In fact, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a very stimulating seminar on, it was called Castes of the Mind, organized by Bhargavi Davar in Pune. And I remember in that meeting, Dr. Gail Omwet, who recently passed away, she was saying, why should we are, I think, bulk of our research is focusing on oppression only. We also need to study privilege and how privilege contributes to, powerlessness or the othering, as Polly said, in others. So it also means focus on, privilege. So, but the thing is that we need to study privilege and oppression, not as, again, individual psychological characteristics of people, but how they serve as structural barriers to realization of human rights. So I'll stop here. So these are the two key challenges that I thought, we could focus on, because this is just the, the initial conversation on human rights. And I've specifically chosen not to focus on gender violence. Maybe we could do that, at a later date. But I just thought that, to draw your attention, to invite your attention to these key challenges of conceptualizing a human rights framework for psychology in India. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope I have not overshot my time. And thank you, Tushar. I've already thanked Professor Tripathi and Professor Panda, and of course, Polly Hagenars. But thank you, Tushar, also, for helping to put this whole thing together. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Vindhya. I think these two presentations actually, it was very nice that you were able to sort of build on what Polly had presented. So I think they don't stand apart. I think they converge. I have questions, but I'm not going to come up with my questions. I think there are people here who would like to come in and may want to join these two presenters with whatever comments they have, whatever, not only comments, I mean, if there are questions, the questions would be welcome. If you have your own things to say, please do that.
Yeah, comments are also welcome, and you're most free to disagree. You're most free to disagree.
That's what I'm saying. That everything is welcome. Yes. We are in the Shastrarth Parampara also, and we are in the dialoguing Parampara also. Okay, we are in the two paramparas. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah,
very Dr. good evening. Verma, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I think you can just come in. Yes.
Very good evening,
come
sir.
In, please.
Yes,
please
yes. Yeah. Myself, Dr. Archana Satsangi, Faculty of Psychology from DEI. Undoubtedly, it was a very grand platform and widened our horizon of knowledge. But my inquiry is just an inquiry, sir. Being psychologists, we are dealing with the welfare of the community and society, undoubtedly. But how we can deal with the legal issues in practical situation and cases? Because we are far away from dealing with the practical, ethical, and legal issues when it comes across. I want to know how to deal with this situation. This is my
would you like to elaborate on that? What kind of legal issues do you have in mind?
No, if it comes in further in my case, if I deal such type of, because being positive psychologist, I deal with the positive psychology area is positive psychology. We deal with the community, but many times the ethical issues come across and we fail to deal with. So in practical situation, how to deal with this? That's my triple inquiry is this. Can
Okay.
be guided?
All right. Please, any two of you or anybody else, I think we should leave that, since I said there's a dialogue, it does not mean that the onus is on the two speakers here, all right? Anybody can come in. Polly, if you want to come in, you can. Vindhya, if you want to come in, please do.
Excuse me, sir. Hello.
Yeah, you're going
Yeah,
to react to Archana's thing?
Yeah, sir. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So at the outset, thanks to NOP for organizing such a platform. Besides that, as Dr. Archana has asked, the most of the legal issues as far as the practice of psychology come up when we deviate from the SOPs, standard operating procedures. We had one a case in one of our districts of Haryana that one of the professors of psychology dealt with the counseling of a harassed woman. While counseling, they unknowingly deviate from the SOP of the counseling technique. In fact, to robust their case, what they have done is they have recorded the counseling procedure. However, that was without the consent of the client. So as far as in context of that case, most of the legal issues only come up when we deviate from the standard operating procedures. So Dr. Archana, my request is that if we follow the code of ethics and the operating procedure, certainly we may not face the legal issues as far as our profession is concerned. So that was my idea.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question? Ms. Vindhya, you want to come in? I think.
Okay, very briefly. I'm not really very clear as to what Dr. Archana referred to as legal, but I think from the response that who is it? Dr. Rajesh Verma gave, I absolutely agree with what Dr. Rajesh said. We do have a code of ethics for, it could be, in our research conduct as researchers. It can be as counselors in psychological practice. And recording something without taking somebody's consent, I think is an absolute breach of confidentiality. And I do not know how this gentleman or whoever this person was actually did it. So if the bedrock of our interactions with our clients, or it could be with our research participants, is based on consent, then this was a clear violation. This was a clear human rights violation. And you also gave this example of a harassed woman. Now, again, to take an epistemological perspective, how do I as a psychologist look at a harassed woman? If I try to find the causes, primarily within her, I say that maybe, you have not been polite enough, to whoever, or, kind of try to impose some kind of a very stereotypical construction of womanhood, onto her. Then I'm actually, in many ways, I'm justifying, I'm supporting, an institution like patriarchy, which again, violates human rights of, say, women in this particular case. So as a psychologist, if I am not sensitive to, or if I do not recognize that this is how power is operating, And especially, I do not know what kind of harassment this was, but if it was, whether it was sexual harassment or psychological harassment by, especially, a man can be a very visible example of how power structures how power structures actually violate rights of women. So yes, as you said, if we have an SOP or if we have a code of ethics, and if we need to stick to that, we will look at principles of consent, dignity of that woman, and then only go ahead. So there's nothing really legal here, Archana, to respond to your question. Do we have that in our mind? Do we have this context in our mind is what we need to be very vigilant about. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Now, Tripathi sir, I have one question, actually 2 questions for Ms. Polly. Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Polly, thank you for your slides, because I couldn't understand what you said, but I could read what you displayed on the screen. The first question is related to your discussion point number 5. I want to know, can human rights be differentiated depending upon the geographical locations?
Yes, that's the first question.
But the question is, can.
Say it slowly. Please say it slowly so that it becomes distinct. Okay.
May I type, sir?
Yeah,
in the
you're
chat
fine.
box?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll type in the chat box. Kindly.
Go ahead and.
On the basis of, okay, sir. Now it is over. No?
Yeah, you are. Please go ahead.
So this is the question I typed in the chat box.
Can human rights be differentiated on the basis of geographical locations?
Yes, that's what.
Yeah, I think it's not only geographical locations. I think what he has in mind is regions.
Can you?
Yeah.
I couldn't hear it.
Of course, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Is the connection okay?
Please.
Okay, I'm typing then. Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask.
Can you hear me now?
It is geography or culture?
That's the same. I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
No.
we can.
Yes.
Go ahead.
You can't hear me.
We can.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, to a certain extent, the basic principles are universal, and a person needs dignity, and especially from us as psychologists, sometimes habits. In the Netherlands, there has been a huge debate, it was already 20 or 30 years ago, about the cultural rights, between parentheses, of genital mutilations, and that's absolutely against the basic principle of dignity and freedom of the person. And freedom, maybe I can add this, that the individual person is only a Western concept when it's when you are regarding it within an economic sense, but Paul maybe a little bit too over a holiness, and you have to to keep a person in its existence and to value someone. So I think, for example, if I go to the kind of poverty, that's completely different in the Netherlands as in other countries. So we have to look at the circumstances, to the context, always and always. Is this an enough answer?
Thank you. Thank you, Polly. Well, I think just to add to that, I think Dr. Verma, I don't know whether you know that, but there are regions where countries have come up with their own definition of human rights. In the context of what's going on in Afghanistan, you may be interested in knowing that some of the Arab countries, have come up with their own declaration based on Sharia principles. So I think that point that the context has to be taken into consideration is a very valid one. And there are cultures where I think, which is what I think Professor Vindhya wanted to point out, they become important. So there is the universal part of it, and then there is also the contextual part of it. Both of those are really critical.
Yeah, I would like to add that,
Please do that.
as I said earlier, contexts that reproduce, either patriarchal or any other kind of hierarchical domination. This hierarchical domination can be by caste, can be by religion. So any context which reproduces that domination and inequality, I think, is frankly not acceptable. So even when people are framing their own, codes of human rights or whatever, I think there are certain absolutely basic, absolute principles of human rights on which, we should have frameworks. That's all I wanted to say.
There is a dialectics here, Professor Vindhya, which sort of the between cultural rights and the universal rights.
Yeah.
And one has to really understand that the conflicts, all kinds of conflicts are possible here. So I think we'll need to see, how the two things can be compromised. Saurabh Maheshwari, you want to come in now? Saurabh?
Yeah. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question for Dr. Professor Vindhya. Ma'am, you talk about the absolute freedom, and actually, as a humanism, I believe in this thing. I am truly supporter of the total freedom, absolute freedom. But as a social psychologist, when I thought about the absolute freedom, I think this can create a kind of the anarchy in this, and maybe lead towards the whole collapse of the social system. Like the way we promote like absolute freedom and the way we try to bring to maintain the what is not, I'm not saying to preserve the culture like old culture and all this, but of course we need a social system in which we are living. So my question is that who will decide that where we should stop the freedom? Whether it is a state, because the state will always try to maintain the social system. But if we look at the individual, we will always try to get the more freedom. So this breach is between this absolute freedom and the control over the freedom is something I don't know who will decide and what and how much we can achieve this thing. That is first thing. My second question is more contemporary in the Indian context, that the human rights and the nationalist approach or national security means you talk about the two big challenges, that the culture and the social order, but I think so presently.
Can we stay only with the first one first? And
ma'am, sir, actually it is all three related. I have three and all three.
Oh, if they're related, then make them one question. Okay.
Okay. So whether is in the name of the national interest or national security, how much we can curb the human rights? And means if you look at the India or the China or maybe in the any other country right now, they are doing in the name of the national security everything they want. and we just ask for our like a freedom, and what we get that in the name of national security, everything they are allowed to do kind of thing. So that is the one challenge we are facing, and how we are going to deal with this thing. And my third question is also related with this thing. Few days back, I was talking to my one of Chinese friend, and I was surprised. I was advocating the human right, and she told me that actually it is not a very good concept. Like, means I realized that thing that she was not very comfortable that we should fight for the human rights so much that like the Indians or the Americans or the Westerns are actually fighting. And then I realized maybe it is upbringing. Like they're so, sometimes it is so much depressed in the culture. Like we are born and brought up in the culture where no one talks about the human rights. So we don't think that is a necessary kind of thing. And in that situation, how we like if we are like so much suppressed and we never thought about and we never know about the human rights, then how we are going to educate these people, or maybe not these people, let's say anyone, that there are human rights and you should fight about the human rights, because they don't want human rights. They're happy what they are getting. Okay, these are my three questions. Sorry.
Okay. Can I respond, Professor Tripathi?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Saurabh, for raising, these kind of questions, which are actually very not only challenging, but have been vexatious. I mean, they don't give room for easy answers. There is no, black and white kind of easy answers, but I'm very glad that you have raised them. Now, coming to your, I don't know whether I'll be able to respond in, great detail or with clarity, but let me try. Now, the first thing, you spoke about social system, but I think I would look at it as maybe you are referring to social institutions. So it could be, the family, it could be education, it could be religion, it could be caste, and so on. Now, I would say that if the social institutions, or as you said, social system, are not based, if they are not based on principles of, okay, forget about, I'm not even going to use the word human rights. If they are not based on principles of mutuality and respect for each other, right? And they are not based on reciprocity, then how can we justify a domination of a particular group over the other? So, for example, let me give this example. Very often we say that the family system in India is often, a big buffer against mental health problems, right? It acts as a protective buffer because of the very close, connectedness, relatedness that we have in our family system. Absolutely fine. I have no disagreement with that. But we somehow, in this process, we gloss over the fact that within this family system, there probably are certain stakeholders who have not been given equal rights, or they have been deprived of equal rights. So if at all, as a psychologist, I want to engage with this, I would say, don't throw the baby with the bathwater, but by all means, let us have a much more democratic family system. How can we democratize the family system, which recognizes the mutual rights of both of all partners, in fact, of all stakeholders, right? Then we can perhaps say that we are moving ahead towards a situation where we recognize, accept, acknowledge the principles of, as I said, mutuality, respect for each other, and respecting the rights of each. So far, whether you take the institution of the family or whether you take the institution of caste, these are the two main pillars. I'm not talking about other institutions, but both of them have been extremely unequal. So first, if we acknowledge that there is inequality, then we can do something about it. But if we start the discussion by saying, well, who decides? Then all stakeholders decide. If you ask me who decides, I am not going to decide, but all stakeholders who are involved here have to decide, right? And the principle on which we decide is rights. That is what I'm saying. It has to be a rights-based kind of an approach. So whether it is, any of the social institutions which are so unequal in our society, if we identify that the root causes of distress or suffering are probably anchored within this inequality, then I think as psychologists, we are responding to structures. And we have to decide. Right, but the beacon for us, the guiding light for us should be rights. If we try to say, well, somebody's rights is much more, important than somebody else's, then I think we are going for a toss. Right, and as far as nationalism and all that is concerned, I do have an answer, but I don't want to, I would like to listen to others what they have to say. But I'm very, very glad that you have raised these issues, and it's wonderful to engage with you here.
Yeah.
Yes, Polly.
Can I add?
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Polly.
if the connection is okay, I will try.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I think this is such an important issue, and I agree very much with what Professor Vinjat just said. I would like to add the idea of freedom, and I'm not talking about freedom as freedom to do what you like. That's not freedom. Freedom in the sense of Amartya Sen, but also freedom in the sense of Erich Fromm, who has written a long time ago, The Anxiety for Freedom. And, there is such a concept as internalized oppression, internalized being othered. And that's what we are, and I am also dealing with in my practice rooms. And it's not that then I say to my client, oh, yeah, you get away for your husband, or you do this or that. No, it's the basis is respect for the client and respect for the dignity of the person. And if you are guiding this slowly, and very, very carefully, then you can help a person to develop in this. We are again in the sense of Amartya Sen, and that respect and that reciprocity. There was can I give an example? It was in the last century, not so long ago, that young girls who were not married and got pregnant, they had to give away the babies right away. They didn't have the right to see the babies and so on. Just very recently, the last decade, the last 10 years, those mothers came up and said that was not okay. And at that time, psychologists and psychiatrists were involved because society was thinking that unmarried young women couldn't raise the children. But maybe that's from one point it's right, but it is completely denying the dignity and also the love and the support a family can give when something could happen. The mothers often were afraid of what neighbors should say. Now we all know what culture can do in this respect. So those dilemmas we have to deal all the time. And the last thing I want to say about this, these discussions are so valuable. And when I have a dilemma in my practice, and we have, and you have that also, I think, we have a kind of intervision and supervision, to come across and those moral dilemmas we encounter in our practice rooms.
Thanks, Polly. Deepak, you want to come in? You have a question? Just talk about, he's talking about, cultural practices and cultural rights. Can they be used interchangeably? You want to elaborate on that, Deepak, if you are there, or?
Good evening, everyone. My audio is patchy, so
go ahead.
My audio is patchy, so very quickly. Yeah, you're right. Thank you for that. is it fair to use these two terms interchangeably? Because I'm not saying it. I think it's been said that there is an inflection point at which these practices become rights, and the confusion of the question I have is that unless I'm through social scientists or social behavioral scientists or applied behavioral scientists, don't really care, understand what that inflection is and understand the dynamics of that inflection, and bring that discussion both to the forefront and into policy. Adoption of human rights as it is defined by the Charter, the UN Charter, will continue to be constrained. Because, and I think Professor Tripathi talked about some of the societies where, including ours, where practices have become rights. And we know that if we look back in the rear view, some of those rights are antithetical to the human dignity. So that's just a point, comment, question.
Thanks, Deepak. Anyone wants to respond to that?
I think Ravi Priya has raised his hand.
No, I'm more.
Do you want to respond to Deepak's thing, or you want to move on to Ravi's point?
No, I had a different concern that I'll share later.
Okay.
After Deepak's thing is responded to.
Okay. All right. Rasvindya, you want to talk about cultural practices, cultural rights? Can they be used interchangeably? Well, if you don't want to, I think let's just think about it. I think how do anything becomes a right? I think a lot of people have to believe that it's the right thing to do, and the right thing becomes, right after people start practicing it. I don't think there is anything very natural about, let's say, that what Polly, for example, was talking about, that only married women are entitled to becoming mothers. We started that cultural practice. Nobody else did. So I think we have to start thinking about that. Ravi, you want to come in now?
Or can I, since Polly spoke about, married women becoming mothers, I can give the example of marital rape in India, which is still not considered to be a crime. Well, there can be different views about it, but one of the arguments in favor of not making it a crime, not criminalizing it, is that it will kind of, destroy the family, institution of the family. Again, as I said, it's very, very contentious, and I do not wish to go into it, but the cultural practice of the husband having, just because he's married, the institution of marriage itself, if it implies consent, if it implies consent, that means you're not really taking into consideration the rights of the wife. Again, as I said, my own personal view is also slightly different. I'm also not in favor of it, but I'm just trying to put these things on the table so that we can look at it and say, well, if we support the husband's right, to having sexual intercourse with his wife, simply because it is the cultural practice. marriage gives the husband the right. If we agree with that kind of a view, then, we are throwing rights out of the window. But once again, it becomes contentious because, you can imagine the floodgates, it will open, we will be flooded with all kinds of cases, and who can really, decide whether there was consent or there was no consent. These become extremely vexatious and contentious issues. I'm aware of that. but I'm just trying to give these kind of examples where at least, some bottom line we can take of consent, dignity, all of the inclusiveness, all of which we have been talking about this evening, as a kind of a common denominator. Can we have a common denominator? And if a particular culture is violating that, then we need to speak up and point out that this is the injustice being created. Anyway, I'll stop here and I'll wait for Ravi Priya to say what.
Can I say something in response
Yes,
to
please,
this
please,
question?
please.
One thing I would very candidly like to say is that cultural practices and cultural rights cannot be used interchangeably because they are not the same. Because some of the cultural practices may be argued out to be, rights, but they themselves do not get translated into rights. And in many cases, wherever they conflict with some of the very fundamental rights of the individuals, they are not considered therefore as rights. And if we read, and I don't know, I mean, maybe in future, we can bring constitution to our discourse as well. Because there is UN Charter, which talks about human rights, but different countries also have different, constitutions that talk about rights, and part of these human rights are already included in our constitutional dialogue, which is a legal document for us. And but then there are many which are recognized, and in future we may also recognize, this. I mean, you must be reading about global warming. And it's not a right, it's not defined in that language, in that legal term. But it might become tomorrow because it affects the livelihood of people. And so if it affects to that extent, it may be tomorrow declared as a very fundamental human right. But it is, as till now it is not. So what I'm saying, human rights, the basket is constantly getting expanded. And whenever there is conflict, then we get into legal discourse. And if we look at legal discourse, then I don't think cultural practices and cultural rights can be used interchangeably. That's one. Second, wherever there is conflict, we cannot have a very plain answer saying, I agree with both Vindhya and Polly, that we have to preserve the cultural practices because that's about the community. We cannot sacrifice some of the very basic rights of individuals because the practices believe, the communities believe or have been practicing few things since centuries. So, I think my view would be that the fundamental rights, of individuals cannot be sacrificed. And whenever legal legal conflicts arise, we have seen that if it is not a very totalizing country like China, we uphold human rights, individual rights. Wherever there is a totalizing of power, the cultural rights then come to the fore, and many times is upheld even if it conflicts with very basic individual rights of people. Rights to life, right? Some of the very fundamental rights. So it is also a question of power. Wherever there is democracy, I think the conflicts are resolved differently. And wherever there is, a different kind of power play, I don't want to get into, all of you are experiencing almost everywhere in this world, then I think we bring a lot of our discourse where preservation of culture is upheld, and that is where we gloss over individual rights. So in other words, what I wanted to say is that this is a dialogue of power and the state. What kind of state it is, what kind of democracy it has, and then what kind of legal discourse we'll have when we talk about human rights. So I'll stop.
Okay. we're talking about, a single truth versus multiple truths. Let's say Kumar, Ravi Priya.
Well, thank you so much. Now, thank you so much, Professor Tripathi, and also both the speakers, Professor Pauli and Professor.
Can you speak a little louder? Ravi,
Yeah.
Can you?
Is it audible
please.
now?
Yeah,
Well,
a little bit better, but then not enough.
Okay. I'll try my best. So, as I said, it has been a wonderful classroom because it's a wonderful learning. Generally, in the classrooms in psychology, we don't hear these kinds of discourses of human rights and all. So, thank you for bringing in such a wonderful topic, such a meaningful topic, and very timely, I would say, because all around the world, including in India, all we hear is human rights violation here and there, and it's important that psychologists somehow need to try to address that to whatever extent possible. Now, having said that, I'm also, I also would like to share a couple of concerns of mine, which are primarily related to the pedagogy that psychologists are habituated to. I'll just take the example of a couple of concepts that were used by Professor Vindhya, like the need for epistemological shift. The example that she gave was about the way generally psychologists, do have the habit of locating problems, whether it is mental health or related to distress or issues in life, within the individual. Although we have seen community psychiatry and other kinds of perspectives, but the point remains that once we go back to our normal everyday classes in psychology, we generally do not talk about epistemological shift. We do not generally talk about the kind of methodological shift that would be required. Similarly, as Professor Pauli also pointed out, the need for the decolonization or decolonial perspective. How many times in the psychology classrooms we talk about such kind of perspective? So my concern is this, that it's going to be really important that pedagogically also we need to take care of such kinds of the needs that have been talked about by both the speakers, the epistemological one, the paradigmatic one, and the associated methodological shifts. There are some other concerns too that I might like to come to later on, but this is the one right now I just thought I would share.
Thanks, Ravi. Any comments? Anyone wants to engage with what Kumar Ravi Priya said? Yeah, please, Pauli, go ahead.
I hope I changed a place. I hope the connection is better.
Good.
Okay. These are very interesting questions. I'm so sorry that psychology lost its links with philosophy, with thinking, with talking, discussion. And that's partly also, I think, in Europe, the discussion culture has been lost a little bit. So I think for psychology, that if we want to include human rights into our education, we need to talk about the concepts we had. We need to talk about the history of psychology, because when you look at the past now 100 years, a lot of racist comments are being made. The whole IQ discussion, the whole idea who is a moral person. It was, I think, in the 80s, around 1980 or something, that the book of Carol Gilligan was published about the feminist approach to psychology. How we are going to do this, because universities, their programs are fixed and they are full. We need a movement for this, for a change. So if you come up with blogs, for example, and stories, we can publish them on the network of the website of the Global Network. Please welcome.
Thanks, Pauli. Thanks. That's very Very nice.
Sir, myself, I have one inquiry.
Archana,
Yeah.
can you just hold on
Yeah,
just
yeah.
for a minute?
Yeah.
I think there's another person who wants to.
Yeah.
There are two persons. One is Professor Namita Pandey. She wants to say something. Namita? Are you there? Unmute yourself, and she wants to make a point about that it's natural to have hierarchies and have the kind of problems which we have been having, violation of human rights and so on. So how do you take care of the emergence of hierarchies and have a society which is where you have equality? I think that's a concern. She says that, well, basically what you need to do is, rather than having laws, you know, build culture where you have respect and where you have reciprocity. That's what I have understood. If she was come in. Otherwise, Archana, you want to say what you wanted to say?
Yes, sir. My question is this, sir. If the violation of the fundamental rights, which are the legal documentation by a person, is possible, then how a psychologist can play a role? Because in college, I see many cases, the adolescent girls are coming who has been suffering with the sexual harassment by very close one, my kith and kin, even my own uncle. So being psychologist, I can deal with that person, the sufferer, but the devaluation of the society, which is the subject, how it can be dealt by a psychologist? Because it is a human right.
Interesting question. Let's see if two of our speakers can address the question which you're raising.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah, please.
Can I come in?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archana, for raising this, because, you know, as I said earlier, I have kind of been involved in developing a module for feminist counseling, which is not only gender sensitive, but based on recognition of human rights. And I can, I mean, to be very brief, I can respond to your concern about, you said when, you know, young students come with stories of sexual harassment, you know, within the family and so on. What do you do as a psychologist? What can you do? Now, even forget about the fact whether you're a counselor or not. But just as someone who is there, you know, as a person who can, as a sensitive person who can respond to such things, I would say even creating a safe space for her to talk about what has happened, right? That I think should be a kind of fundamental responsibility for us as, you know, teachers of psychology. So create a safe space for her to talk about this. And if she has, then very often, you know, in mainstream psychology has always adopted a very victim blaming kind of an attitude. You know, so, and especially in instances of sexual violence where there have been violations of, you know, of the human right to bodily integrity, right? In such cases, very often mainstream psychology has adopted a very victim blaming kind of a stance, you know, and wanting to know, okay, so what were you doing? Where were you? Why did you not say no? Why did you not stop it? What prevented you from going out and complaining? So there are a whole lot of victim blaming responses, you know, that one can give. So as a sensitive teacher, I think number one, you know, after creation of a safe space, we can stop this kind of a, you know, victim blaming attitude. And sometimes even a simple statement like, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, can actually bolster her own sense of, confidence in herself and so on. So move away from victim blaming to some kind of a validation of her experience. And then ask her if she wants to, what does she want to do? So asking her about, what kind of a approach she would like to take. Would she want to go and file a criminal complaint, or would she, whatever. I mean, first of all, instead of imposing something that we know and we want on her, first ask her what she would like to do. And so there are a range of responses that a psychologist, can give. And why I'm saying, or why I'm talking about feminist counseling, is because I have found that is one mode of counseling which bridges the gap between structural, oppression and private or psychological pain. It is some kind of a bridge between understanding of structures, because in this case, if this young girl has been sexually abused by someone within the family, it's a question again of power and vulnerability. Who are the victims of violence? It is those who are vulnerable. So if you understand it from that point of view, then you might be able to do something, to help her. Again, for reasons of time, I don't want to elaborate on this, but I'm glad you raised this, because these are the nitty-gritties. Actually, when we engage with human rights, either in the classroom or beyond the classroom, we are face to face with a number of vexing questions that I think, we need to respond to. So creating a safe space, trying to tell her it's not her fault, shifting the blame, shifting from victim blaming to understanding her. And we all use these words, empathy, power of listening, and all of this. So use all of that. And then try to identify, what is that structural cause? You don't have to say all this to her. But if you adopt that kind of a stance towards her, I think you would have helped her. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Molly, you want to say something?
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. This is wonderful, Dr. Vindya. But what we also can do is, for example, at our schools and universities, have human rights departments, or maybe easier to say, persons who you can confide in, or student psychologists who are helping students and can also help drafting a policy for university, schools, or institutions, or as industries, for companies, which address such issues as sexual harassment, discrimination on all kinds of levels. So this is an initiative we can take.
In fact, sorry, I didn't add here. See, we do have a sexual harassment law in the country, and it is now mandatory for all, universities, or all organizations, in fact, to have this complaints committee. It's called internal complaints committee. But the reason why I didn't refer to that right now is because I think what Dr. Archana was raising was also a case of sexual abuse in the family.
Yeah,
so whereas this particular policy is about the workplace, violations of, women's rights at the workplace, which this law was actually in response to the case of Bhavri Devi, which I spoke about, in my presentation. And it is from that instance that we got a law which says protection of women from sexual harassment at the workplace. So it is now mandatory for all organizations to have that.
It's fantastic.
Thanks a lot.
Vishaka guidelines are what I think.
Vishaka guidelines gave way to the law.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Can I just check with the Miniti? Can we have another 5 minutes? Maybe there are 2 questions.
Yeah, we can have. I also have a small question for Polly, but let others ask first. Yeah, you can have.
Well, Dr. Saroj, he wants to know whether we can sort of differentiate between human and individual rights. That's a question which I think has been, I think that question has been answered in the presentations, but if you want to say something, maybe you should. Are human rights only about individual rights?
Can I answer?
Yeah,
Are you
please
asking
do
me?
that.
I'm sorry. No. And again, the word individual, I would like to change this by or substitute by personal. No, there are in the meantime there are rights of groups and peoples we are talking about.
Yeah.
And very good example are all the stories that are now coming to the fore of indigenous peoples and minority peoples who are really still marginalized and so on. And that's a little bit harder for psychologists to tackle. But still we can, for example, we can try to include our minority or representatives from our minority peoples to our association's boards. For example, New Zealand has a bicultural code of ethics, and they have made a program following this. So that's a good example.
Dr. Herline, you want to come in?
Oh, good evening, sir. My question to ma'am is pertaining and pertaining to intersectionality. Ma'am just had this quest while showing her slide. She said that some professor, she cited that in certain program of him, he said that we should work on privilege. This is quite okay with me, but the lens of intersectionality should be there when we are addressing oppression. Ma'am in her slide showed that it should be culture when human rights were intersecting, but there would be some other categories also. This is my question to ma'am. Why there is social justice for human rights without wearing the lens of intersectionality? This is the one thing. And the second is addressing to her slide only when she was talking about the intersection of culture with human rights. There could be other categories as well, be it age, be it education, be it socioeconomic status, and various other. So my question solely is why we are not considering intersectionality when we are talking about social justice or human rights at first. Thank you, sir.
Okay, you're talking about ma'am. Now you're referring to Professor Vindhya or Professor Polly?
So my question is to Professor Vindhya. I just was going through her slides.
right.
I'm so sorry I didn't address it completely. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Is it Harleen? Is that your name?
Harleen.
Yes, ma'am.
Harleen.
It is
Harleen.
pronounced
Yeah,
as Harleen. I am not a doctor at all. I am just a student. I'm a doctoral student.
Okay, sure. No problem. Again, thank you very much for raising this issue of intersectionality, which we generally, by and large in mainstream psychology tend to kind of ignore. And anyway, since it was just a slide and I didn't want to put in too much of material on that, I'm sorry if you got the impression that I was trying to overlook the intersectional approach. In fact, wherever I could, when I said culture, I referred to, or I meant intersections of, not only gender, but intersections of gender and caste and class, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on, all of which, make up culture. So definitely, I would, affirm what you're saying, that we need to take an intersectional approach that requires us to recognize that there are, several markers or several intersecting levels by which we look at, the psychological. By which we look at, it could be categories of thinking, emotion, behavior, relationships, and so on. So certainly, I think the intersectional approach and how these intersect to not only to create human rights violations, If we don't take that kind of an approach, we will be missing out on a lot of things. So certainly, maybe I didn't use that term simply because, on the slide, we couldn't have too many things. But I, for one, I'm completely in support of taking an intersectional approach to whatever we study. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It addresses my question. Thank you, sir.
So our president is going to have the last word. Unity, where are you now?
Yes.
Please.
No, Polly, this is a very big area. So I don't want you to answer it right away because you use the term decolonial perspective. And a lot of Indians used post-colonial, the term post-colonial. And some of us are still using decolonial perspective. But when you use this term, use this perspective, what is that you are trying to drive home? And what is that you're trying to make visible in human rights discourse, which is otherwise not visible?
Ooh, this is a very
so I can write to you. So that's what I'm saying. Is not
I excuse on beforehand because I'm just a learner in this field, and what for this moment, there is a whole debate between post-colonial and decolonial. What I'm thinking is that what I would love to is that we look at our concepts, what kind of a society we envision. What is our image of a human? It was a long time, it was white, male, middle class, name it all. And that we look at our methods. For example, when we look at our assessments, our diagnostic tools, where were they developed? Are they validated in all the societies? Are there norms for the societies? And how are we using them then? What is the concept of IQ? We know those whole debates, long time. Did we ever apologize in what we did wrong in our past? So all those aspects, and we can go on and on. So I'm now working on the life of a African boy who was taken by the Dutch, by the United East Indian Company from the coast of Africa to Europe and got an education and became a professor and probably the first psychologist. He studied pneumatology, and that was the very old name for psychology. That doubleness, we don't know. We have one, we don't have a canon of famous psychologists, do we? And if we have, where do they come from? So we need a more diverse psychology, I think. So it's just a try of an answer.
I understand, because the colonial psychology obviously which invisibilizes many things. There I agree. We also are witnessing in India, which is very internal to our country, the way the caste operates in India. And many scholars, social scientists are calling it as internal colonization. So, earlier the colonization was understood in the context of somebody coming from outside and colonizing us. But then we have such practices also inside the country. It's the insider who is trying to also colonize. And it's about groups, it's about communities, and how certain communities have no rights, they're not visible. They don't enjoy the kind of rights the other communities enjoy. So what is that you do to free? We'll discuss later, not now. Like decolonial perspective. We are all, we are trapped in that colonial perspective, at all levels.
Yeah.
And we are facing it at all levels. I mean, 2 levels. One external and one very, very internal to us. And we are very uncomfortable to talk about internal colonization. We lack conceptual categories. We also lack this, moral courage, moral ethical, courage to talk.
Exactly, the moral courage we need. And yeah, you're so right. We even lack the words, Why are we talking about indigenous psychologists? Why aren't we talking about dominant psychology? Indigenous peoples, why am I talking about the conquerors or something like this? This is what the norms sleep in, Let's go.
I like this multi-indigenous concept that he used, because urban is also an indigenous, is about an indigenous community. I mean, it adds a claim to that indigenous psychology. So this multi-indigenous concept is also slightly better in the sense that, we continue with the problematic history of the term indigenous, but we then have equalized it by using it for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Polly and Vrindavan. Just from my side. Professor Tripathi will thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor Polly, Professor Vindhya, and all of you who participated in this dialogue, and it has just begun. There are questions which you have raised, and I'm sure that when you go back and mull over whatever has gone on today, probably there are going to be more questions. That was the purpose of the dialogue, and when you come back next time, engage with the other speakers we're going to have here in this dialogue series. So thank you very much. Thank you, Miniti. Thank you, Tushar, for organizing this. Of course, the 2 speakers. And of course, the president of National Academy of Psychology.
I should thank you. In fact, since this is the first webinar, I must say that this was Professor Tripathi's idea. And the moment he sounded, obviously, I used that opportunity. So we just facilitate the process of establishing this, group and helping him initiate lecture series. But it was his idea, and we are institutionalizing that. Thank you, Professor Tripathi.
Thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
very much.
everyone. Thanks a lot.
It was a nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Polly.
And I offer to record my presentation again, so then you can replace it maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that will be a good idea. Yeah.
And I hope we keep in contact, because
you would.
So
we will.
You're part of the dialogue series.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
And this will maintain its energy. The dialogue series will maintain its energy. So we'll continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Professor Tripathi.
Thank you.
Bye, Professor.
Bye, Tushar, and bye
For
all.
assuming all
Thank
your
you so much, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
agreement,
Thanks,
I
everybody.
now end to this meeting.
Right.